Ahobilam is not the kind of place that reveals itself quickly. The temples sit in rugged hills, forested slopes, narrow approaches, and rocky terrain that makes the pilgrimage feel like a journey before the journey even begins. That is the first clue. This is not a neat urban temple district. It is a landscape. A sacred one, yes, but still a landscape shaped by stone, distance, and elevation. That is why Ahobilam keeps pulling viewers into the same question. Is the story mainly spiritual history, a feat of sacred geography, or something that looks almost impossible because the terrain itself is so dramatic? The answer is probably all three. Ahobilam sits inside the larger Nalamala region, where hills, forest, and dry seasonal conditions shape how people move and pray. That matters because sacred places are not built in a vacuum. They sit inside terrain. The path to a temple changes how the temple feels. A steep climb changes the mind. A narrow pass changes the body. And a shrine reached through difficult ground begins to feel earned. This is why the Ahobilam story is so visually powerful. The landscape is not just background. It is part of the experience. By the time a pilgrim reaches the shrine, the place already feels larger than architecture. The most important clue is structural. Ahobilam is not one temple. It is a sacred cluster. That changes everything. A single shrine can be remembered as a destination. But a network of shrines creates a map. And a map creates a story that people can walk through, ritual by ritual. That is why Ahobilam feels like an evidence map instead of a postcard. There is a pattern to the sacred geography. There are routes, stopping points, and a sense that devotion is spread across the terrain rather than locked inside one building. For viewers, that becomes the first evidence point. The mystery is not whether the temples exist. The mystery is how the landscape and the sacred tradition became. A useful way to read Ahobilam is to separate three layers. First, there is the physical landscape, hills, forest, stone, steps, and distance. Second, there is the temple network, multiple shrines that turn the area into a sacred route. Third, there is the living tradition that teaches pilgrims how to understand that route. When those layers overlap, the place stops feeling like a single destination. It becomes a journey with evidence at every stage. So tightly fused. The mythology of Ahobilam centers on Narasimha, the lion-man form of Vishnu, whose presence gives the site an immediate mythic gravity. That legend is not an add-on. It is the reason the place feels charged. When sacred stories attach themselves to a rugged hill region, the landscape starts to look like the story made visible. Cliffs become thresholds. Paths become trials. Caves and rock faces become signs of presence rather than just geology. This is not the same as saying the legend is a puzzle to be debunked. It is more honest to say that the legend and the landscape reinforce each other. The hill feels like a place where a powerful presence would belong, and the story teaches pilgrims how to see it that way. Ahobilam looks cinematic because it forces perspective. The route compresses scale. You see forest, then stone, then a bend, then a shrine, then another rise. Each step changes the emotional frame. That is why the location feels compelling even before anyone explains the tradition. The terrain gives the story movement, pressure, and scale. It delivers motion, texture, and built-in suspense without needing artificial effects. The strongest visual evidence is not a special effect. It is the way the path, the rock, and the shrine keep changing the viewer's sense of distance. You can cut maps, landscape shots, temple details, and walking footage into a story that feels expensive even when the underlying claim is simple. In other words, the site holds attention because the geography creates progression. Every turn gives the eye a new question to follow. Because the geography naturally creates progression. The deeper explanation is that Ahobilam belongs to the long history of sacred geography in India. Places become holy because of text, memory, ritual, patronage, and repeated movement through the same terrain. Once that process starts, the landscape stops being merely physical. It becomes interpreted. And interpretation is powerful. It tells you where to pause, where to climb, where to look, where to feel awe. That is why Ahobilam should not be reduced to either architecture or legend alone. The temples matter. The hills matter. This also explains why the story should be handled carefully. The mystery is not a claim that needs to be inflated. The mystery is the relationship between place, memory, and repeated devotion. A viewer can question the interpretation while still respecting the tradition. That balance is what makes the documentary version stronger. The pilgrim route matters. And the story survives because all three reinforce the same emotional truth. Some places stay famous because they are unsolved. Ahobilam stays famous because it is hard to compress. You can explain the legend. You can map the temples. You can describe the hills. But the full feeling of the place only lands when all of those layers hit at once. That complexity keeps the story alive across generations of memory and pilgrimage. People return because the place cannot be reduced to one object or one photograph. It gives visitors a reason to walk the route again in their minds. Not to prove a ghost. To revisit a landscape that seems to carry meaning in every turn. That is the deeper lesson here. Reverence, scale, and structure carry more weight than exaggeration. The strongest explanation comes from reverence, scale, and structure. Not from pretending the place needs an artificial secret. Not exaggeration. What does Ahobilam prove? It proves that sacred places are often built from route, ritual, and terrain as much as from stone. It proves that difficult geography can strengthen belief rather than weaken it. It proves that a place can be historically important, visually stunning, and emotionally charged without needing any artificial mystery on top. And it proves something else for storytelling. When you have a landscape this strong, you do not need to overstate the legend. You just need to film it honestly. That is why a careful evidence map fits Ahobilam better than a scare story. The real wonder is already there. The real wonder is already there. Temples like Ahobilam do not stay important by accident. They stay important because people return. Pilgrims come back. Stories come back. Ritual routes are repeated until the path itself becomes part of the meaning. That repetition is a kind of power. It keeps the place active in memory even when the landscape is difficult and the walk is demanding. It also means the temples are more than architecture. They are a system of return. And once a route becomes sacred, every ridge and bend on that route inherits some of the same significance. That is why the whole region feels larger than a single shrine. The path is part of the temple. The temple is part of the path. Once a route is repeated enough, it stops being a shortcut between 2 points. It becomes a memory structure. People remember where to turn, where to rest, where the hill steepens, where the forest opens. By the end, Ahobilam is less about a hidden answer than a clearer way of seeing. The route matters because it makes the sacred story physical. The hills matter because they make the route demanding. The temples matter because they give the journey its points of focus. Together, they create a landscape that feels remembered as much as visited. And where the shrine appears after the climb. That memory is what gives the place its staying power. It is not only a monument. It is the experience of arriving there. And once arrival becomes part of the meaning, the hill, the steps, and the shrine all start telling the same story. That is why Ahobilam lasts in memory. It is not just seen. It is traversed. And that journey is exactly what makes the place feel larger than the sum of its stones. It is a landscape you do not just visit. But remember, that is the final clue. So what is Ahobilam, in the end? It is not a mystery in the sense of a broken case. It is a sacred landscape whose power comes from the way geography and devotion became inseparable. The temples are real. The hills are real. The route is real. And the meaning comes from how all three were woven together over time. That is the best kind of documentary ending. If you had to explain Ahobilam in one sentence, it would be this. The place turns geography into devotion. That is why the hills, the route, and the temples cannot be separated. They are parts of the same experience. Not a fake reveal. A clearer way of seeing what was there all along. Ahobilam does not need to be mysterious to be unforgettable. It only needs to be what it already is, a place where terrain itself feels devotional. If Ahobilam made you think differently about temples and landscape, stay with the Mystery Atlas TV. The next investigation follows another place where geography and story become impossible to separate. Subscribe for the full series, and tell me in the comments whether Ahobilam feels more like architecture, pilgrimage, or landscape. One more detail matters before we close the file. Ahobilam is not powerful because it gives a simple answer. It is powerful because each layer points to another layer. The legend points to the terrain. The terrain points to the route. The route points to repeated devotion. And repeated devotion turns movement into memory. That is why the site still feels active instead of frozen. A stone building can be photographed in a second. A sacred route has to be understood through time. That difference is the key. The temples are not isolated monuments. They are stations in a larger sacred landscape. The walk between them is part of the evidence. The difficulty of reaching them is part of the meaning. And the memory of returning is part of why the place endures. So the question is not whether Ahobilam is mysterious enough. The better question is why the landscape makes devotion feel so physical. That is the final evidence pattern. Route, ritual, terrain, memory. Each one supports the others. Remove the route, and the temples feel less connected. Remove the terrain, and the journey loses its force. Remove the memory, and the place becomes only architecture. Ahobilam lasts because all of those pieces remain tied together. That is what makes it worth returning to.